Thank you very much. And if I could just add on that, in the current issue, Craig Story has an article in it, which is outstanding, and so you've got to get it if you want a good grade in his class. But thank you for the invitation here to share a few thoughts with you. Let me start by saying I'd like to share some reflections on a couple of claims of intelligent design. This is brand new material. I'd appreciate not being out on the web for a month or two yet, because I really, is the first time, I'm looking for some feedback. And I want you to give me a little feedback. So on the paper, all of you pick up a little copy over here. But I want feedback from you. I've got my email address here at the top, and I'd like to hear from you, good, bad, or indifferent, whatever. Because I want to see if I'm way off base or if this makes sense or whatever. And essentially, what triggered a lot of this is, as Brian said, Steve Meyer just came out with a fabulous book, Signature in the Cell. It's really getting a lot of good press and a lot of publicity for Steve. Steve is the director of Discovery Institute, where they're pushing the intelligent design issue. And I think the real focus here is the scientific basis for intelligent design. So my intent today here is to comment and think about two particular claims that ID makes. And if any of you don't have this sheet, you need it, because I have no slides, I have no other backup. These are the notes for your class. So you don't have to take the notes. These are all the notes for it. And I'm going to start by giving you my conclusion. So I'll start from the end, and then we'll come backwards a little bit. So I've got two claims, one on each side of the page, one for each side here. First one is the design inference. This is really the hallmark of intelligent design. ID claims that there are patterns in nature which are best explained by the action of an indeterminate intelligent design agent. That's the basic claim of intelligent design. We'll talk more about what this really means. My conclusion is going to be that this is a faith statement and not a scientific statement. That's the conclusion that I will make. It is a faith statement and not a scientific statement. If you turn it over, the second claim is really a restatement of the basic claim. It's a restatement in terms of information. It says DNA information is complex specified information. We'll explain what that is. All other complex specified information is known to be generated by intelligent beings. Therefore, DNA information must have been generated by an intelligent agent. That is the claim. That is the main theme and conclusion of this book. The entire book is meant to justify this point. My conclusion is going to be is that not all complex specified information is generated by intelligent beings. Invalidates the middle phrase here of this particular claim. And I'll try to explain why I think that is true. So those are the conclusions, right? That's the end. So now you're free to close your eyes and take a nap or daydream or whatever you do in these classes. But meanwhile, we'll go back and start from the beginning, and we'll try to see if some of this makes any sense. Now, if you start back here on claim number one, the basic design inference, a lot of design talk started in 1802 with William Paley. And William Paley pointed out that if you're walking in a forest and you stumble over a stone, you're going to look at the stone and say, yeah, okay, that's all right, and you go on. But if you stumble over or discover a watch, you say, there must have been a watchmaker around here. There's a difference in our assessment of a stone versus a watch. And we kind of know intuitively that the watch was designed. And he basically said, look at nature, you can see that it was designed, ergo, there is a designer. Now, all of this has, Paley took a lot of heat from Charles Darwin and everything else after that, but in the last 25 years or so, there's been a resurgence of this whole movement of design. And what happened really, a number of people have tried to go back and look at Paley's design argument, but recast it into what they view as a more scientific and quantitative mold. Said, how can we quantify this process of this intuitive thinking? Says, yeah, no, that's not design. Yeah, this is. Can we quantify it? So William Dembski, one of the leaders of the ID movement and an ASA member, worked out what he calls the explanatory filter. So explanatory filter, he says, all right, here's how we can help decide whether something was designed or not. So he said the first question that you have to ask is, if you have some event or some object that you discover or whatever, says, is it a high probability event? For example, I've got a quarter here. I toss it up in the air, right, and let it fall. What's the probability that it's going to fall? Pretty high. Take another one and I throw it up. It falls. Probability is 1. Why? The law of gravity. He says, okay, if you've got high probability, yeah, this is a necessity thing. Some natural law. All right, that's easy. Now, I keep throwing quarters up in the air, right? Okay, I got a few quarters. I got 4 of them here. Hey, they stayed on. Okay, what's the probability that I actually got the tails, heads? Well, it turns out there are about 16 possibilities if you add them up, so its probability that I got this was about 1/16. That's not very high, it's not very low, it's kind of intermediate. So he says, is this an intermediate probable event that it came out this way? Yeah, so it's probably a combination of necessity and chance. In other words, law of gravity wasn't a necessity. The fact that it came out tails or heads, that's a matter of chance. Okay, no problem. But if it's not intermediate probability, very low probability, what do? And let's imagine now, you have to imagine that I got another 100 quarters. Yeah, I couldn't carry them all, so I couldn't quite do it here. The table's too small. But imagine you had 100 here. Okay, now you look at the sequence of heads and tails that came out. It's a pretty low probability, right? It turns out to be about 1 in 10 billion or something like that. So it's a very small probability. Now what? Well, Dembski says you have to ask, is it a specified event of small probability? Well, no, because I don't know what specified means, so it must be a combination of necessity and chance. But what does specified really mean? We'll come back to this several times in this lecture, but very explicitly, what he means is specified is that it relates to something you recognize, something that has a particular recognizable pattern, something of meaning. So, for example, tails, heads. No particular meaning, could go on. If, however, it had been all tails, you would have said, now that's peculiar. It doesn't matter that the probability of it is exactly equal to any other possibility, but it's a pattern that we recognize. It is specified. Any time at a football game, you start with the coin toss, and somebody calls it. That's specifying it. You specified heads or tails, and if it comes up the same, that was a specified event. So in that case, he says it was caused by intelligent design. It matches something you recognize. Okay, now let's leave it there a little bit. We can come back to that. But that is the explanatory filter. Now, how do you apply this in what we call retrospective causal analysis? What in the world do all those 10 syllables mean? It means that suppose I were to come across here, I had the tails, heads, right? Okay, we had something like that. Suppose now that you hadn't seen me and somebody came in late at class, and you come in and you see these quarters here. How would you know whether I flipped them all or whether I had deliberately placed them down? Were they designed or was it chance? How would you tell? Well, that kind of notion of going back and saying, what happened in history if you weren't there to see it, and you come upon it later, and you want to determine what happened, that's the fancy name for that is retrospective causal analysis. So we need a little bit of help. So, well, Dembski's explanatory filter is a good start. But what I found really interesting in Steve Meyer's book, the first time I've ever come across it really, but Steve Meyer, who's spent his career in focusing on this, spells out and says that there's some additional things besides the explanatory filter that you have to do. He draws on Charles Lyell, he draws on Charles Darwin, and then he draws on this guy called Michael Scriven that I had never heard about and whose books I could not find in the library here or at MIT, and I'm hoping that one of you will be interested enough to dig it out and find it, because he's written on causation in the 1950s, I think, 50s and 60s, and Steve Meyer quotes him in terms of saying that if you want to figure out who did something in some designer, something in the past, you also have to show that that designer existed and was able to do the job. Those are two additional things that you have to do. Now, what does that mean? Let's think about this again. You know, if you came into the room late and you saw these quarters, and you'd look around a little bit, especially if you saw 100 heads all together, or if you saw 2 heads and a tail, 2 heads and a tail, something like that, you'd look around and say, yeah, there's several human beings around here. Yeah, I can reasonably infer that one of these human beings came and deliberately placed them down. That's a good inference. Well, I know human beings exist, and I know they are capable of manipulating the coins. I know that independently. So I meet the criteria for Michael Scriven's retrospective causal analysis. Now suppose you came upon this, but you knew for some reason that there were no human beings within sight. Now, you knew with absolute certainty that it could not have been a human, but you still see these, 100 heads in a row. Now what are you going to do? Well, maybe you'll hypothesize that a chimpanzee came around and put them all in place. So what is it you have to do to really convince me of that inference? How can you infer that it was a chimpanzee that did it? What you have to do, Scriven says, you have to show that chimpanzees exist. Well, they kind of exist off in the zoo. Maybe one of them escaped and came around, but you can show they exist. Then you have to show that they're able to manipulate a coin. Okay? But that is something that is scientifically, something you can scientifically study. You can go out and see it. You can measure that, and that's a key point. Now, maybe they can, maybe they can't. I don't know. But suppose you're trying to tell me that you can infer from this that this was done by a unicorn. Okay, I'm convinced that unicorns are able to twist the coins. They're able to do this, and there was a unicorn here, and he came and arranged it in this set. Well, it sounds ridiculous, but my point is that in order for that to be a scientific claim, you have to be able to scientifically study unicorns. You have to be able to study whether or not they can manipulate coins. You see where I'm going with this? You have to be able to have access to scientifically study the designer and his methodology. Okay. If you can't study him scientifically, you can't make a statement out of that. And now you're seeing what I'm getting at. So the fancy terms that Scriven gives to it is causal adequacy, causal existence, and causal uniqueness. These are the fancy terms of what you have to show about a designer in order for you to conclude an actual design inference. Now, this is what Steve Meyer says, but how does he do it? Well, it's really fascinating because he says on causal existence, for example, he pleads the exception. He says, I don't need to show causal existence. Why? He says, because Michael Scriven gives us an out. He says, if you can show that you're the only explanation around, you don't have to show the existence. I think there's a big yellow flag here. It's a real problem here. He says, Logically, one can infer the past existence of a cause from its effect, when the cause is known to be necessary to produce the effect in question. If there are no other known causes, if there is only one known cause of a given effect, then the presence of the effect points unambiguously back to the uniquely adequate cause. So he basically punts. He says, you know, I can't do this, but it's the only explanation. Now, I've got two comments on this. One is, if you can't show that the causal existence, how can you say that it is a viable candidate to be causally unique? Okay. The second thing I want to say, there's an interesting conundrum here, isn't it? Just in general, if you sit back and think, if a design inference can be valid only if the existence of that designer can be independently verified, then how, logically, can a design inference ever be used to infer the existence of that cause? It's a circular reasoning. It's a circular reasoning. So I hope some of you are interested in philosophy and in logic, and you can dig into this a little further, because I have not seen this discussed anywhere. And I wish I would have been able to access Scriven's work to be able to understand this. But it just seems to me that something is tough here, that the design inference cannot be used to demonstrate the existence of that designer. Now, to be a little bit clearer, I'm talking about the class, you know, the class of designers, like human beings. If you go into a cave and find the alphabet there, you know, you may not be able to prove who did it or which individual, but you can do a study on human beings and what they can and can't do. So you can scientifically study the existence of that class of designers. Now, as far as adequacy is concerned, there's another whole issue that what does Meyer do with that? He says, indeed, uniform and repeated experience confirms that intelligent agents, conscious, rational beings such as ourselves, can produce information-rich systems, including systems containing digitally encoded, functionally specified information. Intelligent design is causally adequate to produce this effect. And of course, this is a natural lead to our next page, because what he basically says, of course, he says, we know that human beings can generate information-rich systems. So therefore, an intelligent designer can certainly generate information-rich systems. Now, I think you understand how weak that system is for several reasons. One is the analogy is tough because we've never seen human beings generate DNA, at least not from non-living to living cells. We can kind of duplicate it, we can tweak it, but we've never created it. So this demonstration is kind of weak. So it's a big leap over here. And again, this uniqueness comes into play. That's room for a whole nother lecture. I won't even get into it today, which is this notion of uniqueness. He spends a lot of time in the book showing that all other possible explanations are in. Now, I think you recognize that having studied a set of explanations and showed they're not adequate is not the same as showing that no adequate explanation exists. So to claim uniqueness here, granted, no scientist I know of claims that we've solved the problem of development of life from non-life. Nobody's figured that out. But simply to say that none of the current explanations are valid isn't the same as saying that none is possible. So this whole notion of uniqueness is tough. So I would submit to you that neither adequacy nor existence nor uniqueness have really been adequately shown. In fact, I think his book does the opposite of what he wants. He wants to convince us that those three are given. I think it really clarifies that they aren't. That's my own personal view. So where does that leave us on this first claim? Well, I think it really means that a design inference, can in fact be a good scientific conclusion as long as the designer and its methodology is available for scientific study. If it isn't, it's a faith statement, not a scientific statement. So now you start to understand why you have a polarizing response to ID. Because for Christians, of course God exists. Of course he's able to do it. The existence and the adequacy and the uniqueness are a given. It's deep into our psyche, we know. So when we hear the design inference, it's an obvious. Of course it's true. And so you go around and give this lecture at churches. And Steve Meyer is, well, absolutely. Now, from the atheist point of view, he says, say what? Of course it doesn't work. And so the response from the idea advocate is, what? You're just rejecting it because you want to reject God. Well, yeah. Okay, that's what the atheists do, right? So, yeah, this is kind of obvious here. So you get polarized and then kind of caught in the middle. Are some of us who, yeah, I believe God exists, but, you know, this isn't really a good scientific claim. And we get beat up for both sides. And it's really hard. But so that's why I kind of saying that this is a really good faith statement. Let me back up and say that again more carefully. Design inferences can be good scientific statements if they refer to human beings or other intelligent beings that do designs. That's valid. When it refers to an unknown, indeterminate designer that cannot be studied, then it is a faith statement and not a scientific one. All right? Now, what Steve Meyer said about adequacy here tells us we need to talk about information. So turn the back side of your page and let's look at information. And now that we got to this point, Bo owes me lunch because he bet I could never get here this far. But, all right, DNA information is complex specified information. What is this? Now let me talk just a little bit about what information is. It's a really tough concept. Very few people understand information. There were two people who are really responsible for information theory. The first is Claude Shannon from Bell Labs, who wrote a paper in 1948, 55 pages long. It's a superb engineering paper, way over my head, but it's extremely interesting. First guy to quantify information in a serious way. The second one is Rolf Landauer from IBM. And I'm delighted to say that one of my privileges in my career was, when I was at IBM, was to have Rolf Landauer report to me. And he was emeritus fellow at the time. He had been director of the physical sciences. But I was able to have many a one-on-one, one-hour discussion with him. And he is just one of the biggest intellects I've ever known. And so what little I know about information, I got from him and his group. And one thing that he published in 1970 is a profound statement that information is physical. Information is physical. That has so many implications we can't even begin to address it right now. But the one aspect that we do want to address here is that all information is stored or transmitted in a physical embodiment. Now, for those of you who like math, I've got an equation here. We could ignore that a little bit. But what it really means is that you can quantify the amount of information. You know, take these quarters, you know, put them in here. I got 4 quarters here. How do I quantify the information here? Well, if you want to deal with the equation, you find out there are 4 bits of information, 4 binary digits here. That's kind of obvious. I have 4 quarters. Now, in other situations, it's a little harder to do the calculation, but that's a little homework for you. But there's something I do want you to understand, and that is that the technical term for this kind of information is complexity. Complexity is the technical term for this kind of information. Now, what does that mean? What does complexity mean? Well, take a look at this quarter. Now, you all know what a quarter looks like. You might even have 1 or 2. And I just told you that 4 quarters here gives us 4 bits of information. Now, suppose you were to take this quarter and go to the machine shop and grind both sides perfectly flat. All right? Completely flat on both sides of each quarter. Now, how much information do I have? How much information is there? 0. 0. Because everything I do is equal. Okay? Every combination is perfectly equal to every other one. There's no change. There's no complexity. You have to have complexity in order to convey information. You have to have complexity to convey information. If it were completely smooth, you could not have any information. How much complexity do you need? Well, you don't need very much. All you need is just enough complexity to tell the difference from one side to another. Okay? That's all you need. So you don't need a whole lot, but you have to have something. So the more complexity you have, then the more information you can carry. And that's really what it's all about. Okay? The physicists have a way of quantifying it so you can tell you exactly how much information you could carry. What's the maximum? You can't really do. All right, so you know what complexity means now. All right, that's complexity. Now, when these guys use the word specified complex information or complex specified information, whichever way you said it, what do they mean? Well, complex, it's not the same as complexity. Complex means you have a lot of complexity. How much? It's subjective. Like I said, 100 quarters is a lot. 4 quarters is not. So complex means you have a lot. That's all it means. Really. What does specified mean? Well, we mentioned that earlier, right? And I said specified was whether you recognize the pattern in some way. And what Steve Meyer says more specifically is that it's specified when that information has relevance or application with meaning or function. Meaning or function. And that's key. Let's explore that a bit more. I told you before, if it was all heads, well, it's kind of specified, or you called it, and that has a particular meaning. But we have to dig into this a little bit further. And to put this in context, when you read that quote from Meyer in the middle of the page here, although a computer program may be similar to DNA in many respects and dissimilar in others, it exhibits a precise identity to DNA insofar as both contain specified complexity or specified information. What's he saying here? All right, he's saying that DNA information is complex specified information. All right, let's take him at his word for that for now. Then he's saying that a computer program is complex specified information. Ta-da-ta-da! They're both complex specified information. Okay, we've created the identity. But what I would suggest to you as you think about this, that he missed something. And actually, he knows about it because he says it. And I'll read a quote to you in a minute. But there are 2 ways in which you can have specificity in information. 2 different ways. First is what I call meaning, or abstractly defined information. And this is very important to understand. What is the significance of abstractly designed information? That really means that the specificity comes out of the meaning. It is the significance that is arbitrarily attributed to some physical configuration. Well, let's go back to our quarters, right? Remember, we ground these off and they're completely smooth? Now, in order to get the information, we have to put complexity back. Now, what kind of complexity do we need in order to get information? Well, as I said before, you don't need very much. You just need to know heads or tails. It takes just a little bit. But think about it. Does it matter what I put on here? I mean, in this quarter, why do we call it heads and tails? Well, because you have George Washington's face on here, so I figure that's heads. Whatever's on the back, Massachusetts coin, okay, that's tails. But if you think about it, it's totally arbitrary. It doesn't matter what you call heads, what you call tails. And the point is that the meaning that you attribute to each side of the coin is independent of the physical configuration. I mean, you could put an H on one side and a T on the other. But I could also say the H means tails and the T means heads. Who cares? It's the same thing. That's so important to remember. The meaning is independent of the physical configuration. And take you off. I have to use a chalkboard since it's here. Okay, you all know what this means. But does the meaning of the letter A have any bearing to the physical configuration itself? Okay. All it has to, it doesn't matter if it's in chalk, it doesn't matter if it's in ink, doesn't matter what the chemistry of it is. What does matter is the shape. You know, you can distort this. Okay, this is also 1. You know, and you know, all sorts of. You get a lot of flexibility here. So there's a range. But think about it even deeper. Suppose that whoever created the alphabet, and I don't know who did that, but way back, why this particular shape? Could have been anything, right? It's an arbitrary assignment of meaning. Now, many of you are psych majors here. This is a very key point in terms of consciousness, the ability to do abstract thinking and to do abstract meaning to physical configurations. You know, that's what we mean by abstractly designed information. And same with computer code. We design computers. That was my career, designing computers. The key things, you know, we always say a certain collection of electrons or lack thereof is a 0 and a 1. That's what we do. But you know, it doesn't matter whether you'd say the group of 1,000,000 electrons is a 1 and the other is a 0 or vice versa. It doesn't matter. It doesn't depend on the physical configuration. Now, in contrast, there's a functional information. It derives its specificity from functionality and not abstraction. Let's take our quarter again. Take our quarter, we've got it completely ground off. It's perfectly flat, you know, no information. You go to the Coke machine and put it in, and it works. It's a nice slug, you know. It goes and it works. It's functional. There's no meaning. You know, I mean, you don't have to have any meaning. It's physical shape. I mean, you can't just take any coin and put it in. You know, it has to be the right size, right weight, and the right thickness before it'll activate the Coke machine. But it is functional. It's functional. So it has specificity because it's functional, not because there's any abstract meaning to it. Okay? So that is a different kind of specificity. And so it's very important to recognize that difference. And by the way, Steve Meyer fully understands that there are 2 different ways of being specificity. Here's, and he fully understands that DNA is functional type of specificity rather than abstract. For example, he says on page 109, although DNA does not convey information that is received, understood, and used by a conscious mind, it does have information that is received and used by the cell's machinery to build the structures critical to the maintenance of life. DNA displays a property, functional specificity, that transcends the merely mathematical formalism of Shannon's theory. So he gets it. DNA information is functional information, whereas computer code is abstractly designed information. He gets it. But then he blends them together. And he says, well, they're both specified complex information, therefore they must have the same source. And I said, no, not quite, because functional configurations can either be designed by intelligent beings or they can be generated by natural processes. Okay? I mean, there's no abstraction here that requires an intelligence. Functioning can work. You know, one of the examples I list here is the Oklo natural nuclear reactor. The nuclear reactor is very delicate and complex. You know, there are 15 sites in the African country of Gabon where we have evidence that about 1.7 billion years ago, there were natural nuclear reactors. They actually came together under normal natural processes, and they fired up and they ran until they ran out of fuel and they went. Okay? So, I mean, functionality doesn't require an intelligence in any particular form. And of course, functionality, you know, isn't just a chemical sort of thing. Biologically, natural selection in replicating systems is extremely powerful in preferentially preserving what are functional configurations. So this is an important distinction that I believe Steve Meyer missed. You know, the fact that functional specificity doesn't have to derive from intelligence. Abstractly designed specificity does. And once you recognize that DNA is functional specificity, you can no longer say it must have been designed by an intelligent agent. Okay? So in that sense, I think the middle phrase here of the claim number 2 does not hold up. So let me now repeat my conclusions, So there are two things, and there are many, many, many more things we could discuss. This is just a wonderful book to discuss. If you want to know more about the whole topic, it's a great one, but it's over 500 pages. It takes a lot of reading here. But in essence, in my opinion, the core design inference, I see a design in nature, therefore it must have been designed. That kind of inference can be done scientifically if you can scientifically study the designer and its design methodology. But if that designer is not accessible to you scientifically, then it becomes a faith statement. Okay. Second claim in terms of information, DNA information and human-generated information are very similar, in fact. But there's a key distinction in the fact that most human-generated information is abstract designing. In fact, the hallmark of intelligence is abstraction. We can also make functioning tools, but abstraction is the hallmark, of psychology, really, and what you can do, whereas DNA is a functional piece. So that's basically my story. Any questions? Got a few minutes here.
These little sessions here. Let's please give Randy a hand out.
All right, got a few minutes for discussion.
I did have one question about this claim one. I mean, it's probably tangential. What do you mean by indeterminate intelligent design? You don't mean to say arbitrary. I mean, I don't know.
Well, this is quite a phrase, because I used to, in my talks, present this as the ID claim, and I would write, there are patterns in nature which are best explained by the action of a supernatural intelligent design agent. And I incurred the wrath of all the ID advocates. It's like, how dare you suggest it's supernatural? No, it is indeterminate, because we cannot determine the nature of the designer. All we can do is determine that it was designed. But you know nothing about the designer. And this has always struck me for many, many years, and it wasn't until this Spyer's book came out that I could really put the terminology onto it. But, this notion that you can determine design in the absence of a designer, or in the absence of being able to study the designer, I think is the big gaping hole in the ID. But they insist, it's the ID advocates who insist that the intelligent design agent is indeterminate. All you know about the agent is that it's intelligent. Yeah, and I think there's some serious philosophical problems with that. Any other? Makes sense? You follow any of this, or where's the weakness in it? Yes?
There's specified functional information when it's applied to DNA, and then you said that it can either come from intelligent design or natural causes.
Mm-hmm.
If we apply it to DNA and it works for DNA, why does in that fact just the fact that it
Mm-hmm.
can be, the DNA can be proven by natural causes,
Right.
as well as intelligent design,
Yes.
what method do we have to choose intelligent design over?
Okay, very, very good point here. If functional information can be generated by either natural processes or by intelligent agents, then how can we say that it wasn't an intelligent agent? So I tried to pick my words carefully. I don't believe in this argument that we rule out the role of an intelligent agent. What we do say is question the validity of the statement that it had to be an intelligent design. Okay, there's a subtle difference in there. And because the point is, an intelligent agent can build a functional unit, okay, which for all practical purposes is identical to something that may come in nature. So how can you tell the difference? You can't. So you can't rule out that an intelligent agent was there. But the argument here is that it had to be an intelligent agent, that was the only source. Over and over again, that's the theme. So that, I think, is the difference. Does that get your question?
Yeah, but also does the fact that is a flaw, that it could be caused by natural causation, does that somehow lessen the argument as well? Does it?
Well, the fact that it could be natural, violates this uniqueness. See, Steve Meyer says over and over again, an intelligent agent is the only explanation. So I'm saying it's not the only one. So that's what it invalidates. It doesn't invalidate it that there's an intelligent designer there. And for most of us as Christians in science, I think most of us feel that there's a false dichotomy here, that it had to be either natural processes or an intelligent agent. So I consider myself a strong intelligent design advocate in the sense of a faith statement, not a scientific statement. And I believe the intelligent agent designed the information, but through a natural mechanism. So, I don't view these as mutually exclusive. That the intelligent agent isn't ruled out, but I don't see an argument that follows that it had to be an intelligent agent because of because the types of information are the same. Any other questions? Yes.
I really appreciated how you showed how specified is a troubling word.
Mm-hmm.
Specified. My recollection of Dembski's first book, Design was that it's not, there might be other ways to show that something is specified without having to be as subjective as, say, some person recognizes. Something about being able to compress it into
Yes.
if you have a string of a million quarters and you can compress it into a pattern that can be described in a small amount,
Right.
but that shows that it was specified because something enormous is able to be compacted down into a small amount.
Yes, you almost got it right there. That degree of a lot of information that can be expressed in a smaller is really part of this measure of complexity. Because some things that look enormous, but they're actually fairly simple because you can find ways to describe them in a very small set. So that aspect of the argument was a quantification of how much information is really there, and sometimes it's not as much there. So there's less design if you have a smaller piece. But in terms of specificity and what it is, Dembski kind of agrees with this Scriven approach to a point, because he says, and well, I'll quote what Meyer says about Dembski. He says, Dembski theorized that we reliably detect intelligent activity when we observe events that are both improbable and specified, where events are specified when they conform to a particular kind of pattern, namely a pattern that can be recognized independently of the occurrence of the event in question. So it seems to me in this book he's continually arguing against ID and comes out and says that ID is therefore proven. But there's this whole point of the independent pattern. Dembski says you have to be able to recognize the pattern independently from the event in question. But then you apply it to the living cell, you really don't have that independent pattern. So its specificity is a very interesting concept there. I mean, all of these things are really complicated to think about. I've been wrestling with these for 15 years, and I'm still far from understanding them. So it's okay if you sleep on this a couple of nights before you really grasp it. Okay. Anything else? You might owe me dinner if I finish a minute ahead of time. Yeah, right.
A bit off topic, but something in your answer a couple minutes ago struck me. It seems that a lot of science is about unification. You want to take theories that, the way the universe works, the way strong forces and weak forces work, and gravity works, and try and find some way to come up with the answer that sort of puts them all together, that explains everything.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, at the same time, this issue and many others seem to bifurcate people. They believe this and not that, and so the Christian is going to say there is a creator, and science may contradict that. We're going to ignore science, and the scientists might come the other way. Why do you think there's not more of what I hear you articulating, which is a willingness to have both, and
This is a great question, and I will refer you to a profound paper that was just posted last week by none other than Mark Knoll. You know Mark Knoll, right? The author of Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. You can find it on the biologos.org website. You know Biologos, which Francis Collins started. Biologos.org has some postings related to the workshop we had a few weeks ago over there. One of the papers that was contributed was by Mark Knoll, and he, as a historian, goes back and talks about the history of the development of these ideas that are prominent in American evangelical thought. And specifically, he talks about where did this idea come from that you have to have a choice of either God or a scientific explanation. Where do we get this notion that it's either creation or evolution? Where do we get this notion that it's either an intelligent design or it's a natural process? Where do we get this notion? And he traces it, goes all the way back to the 12th century of Duns Scotus, this Franciscan monk, and the concept of univocity. Now, you always have to increase your vocabulary in college classes, right? So this is your vocabulary increase for the day. Univocity. I hadn't heard it until three weeks ago, so it's completely new to me. Univocity, but read his paper. He explains it. He basically, univocity is really that there's only a single essence of being, and that concept began to be applied to this. There's only one type of explanation possible, and that evolved over the last few hundred years to the concept of where univocity is this one explanation will displace the other. The scientific explanation will replace the explanation of God and vice versa. And so, you know, this has been around for hundreds of years, and it's not going to disappear overnight. But anyway, I just refer you to that because he's got a very deep insight on that. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.